Welcome to this explainer. When we think about the Industrial Revolution, our minds usually jump straight to massive steam engines, right? Or maybe crowded factories. But today, we're zooming way out. We're looking at a massive global catalyst. The era between 1750 and 1900 didn't just change how we made stuff, it literally rewired the entire global order. Which brings us to a huge, kind of mind-bending question. How exactly did a bunch of factories in Europe manage to redraw the map of the entire world? I mean, it sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But here's the reality. This smoke pouring out of those European and American smokestacks set off a massive global chain reaction. We are talking about fundamentally shifting borders, the birth of entirely new economies, and millions of people suddenly on the move.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We're going to break this era down into 4 parts: justifying global expansion, state power and resistance, feeding the industrial machine, and finally, a world in motion.
All right, starting right off with Section 1, justifying global expansion. So as industrialized nations got richer and richer, they started pushing outward, aggressively. But to do that on a global scale, well, they needed a theory to rationalize it all. And that brings us to the incredibly dangerous concept of social Darwinism. Thinkers of the time actually took Charles Darwin's biological theories, survival of the fittest, and weaponized them, applying them to human politics where they absolutely didn't belong. Wealthy, powerful nations basically argued, hey, it's entirely natural for us to increase our wealth, even if it's at the direct expense of less developed countries. Right alongside that was this idea of the civilizing mission. Expanding powers essentially framed their aggressive global conquests as a supposed favor. Yeah, you heard that right. It was this deeply ingrained, really problematic belief that they were bringing light to people they deemed culturally inferior, all while quite conveniently taking over their land and resources. Moving right along to Section 2, state power and resistance. Let's see what happens when these theories hit the real world. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how those theories translated into reality. You're looking at a famous political cartoon of England depicted as an imperialist octopus. It's even wearing a top hat. You can see it wrapping its tentacles around lands everywhere, from India to Canada to Egypt. But it's absolutely crucial to remember Britain wasn't the only sea monster in the water here. France, the United States, Russia, and Japan, they were all reaching their tentacles across the globe too. Now, contrast all those grand claims about a civilizing mission with this incredibly stark reality. This is King Leopold II of Belgium, depicted squeezing the Congo in literal rubber coils. The sheer, well-documented horrors of Leopold's private ownership of the Congo eventually became so extreme that the Belgian government was officially forced to step in and take it over. And we actually saw the exact same shift happen over in Indonesia, with the Dutch government taking the reins from the private Dutch East India Company. National governments were officially becoming global empire managers. But, and this is a massive but, it is vital to understand that indigenous populations did not just sit back and submit to all this expansion. Not at all. All around the globe, fierce, organized, anti-colonial movements formed to fight back. Down in Peru, Tupac Amaru II led a massive uprising against the Spanish. Over in West Africa, Samori Touré fought a fierce resistance against the French. And in North America, indigenous groups organized what became known as the Ghost Dance Movement. So the crucial point is that resistance wasn't always strictly military. Sometimes it was deeply cultural and spiritual, as we can see with Dessous Ghost Dance. This was a powerful religious movement. It was designed specifically to drive away white settlers and reclaim the traditional pre-European ways of life that were just being rapidly swallowed up by these growing industrial empires. Which brings us to our third section, feeding the industrial machine. Let's look at the economics driving this. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing the actual economic engine driving all this conquest. The industrialized world had an absolutely insatiable hunger for raw materials. It was like a giant machine that just needed more and more fuel. So entire regions of the globe were completely carved up and transformed into dedicated export economies. Egypt's whole economy rewired just to produce cotton. The Amazon in Central Africa basically bled for rubber. West Africa saw a massive surge in the palm oil trade, and South America became this colossal meat producer for the rest of the world. The entire globe was specializing for one reason: to serve the industrial core.
As you can probably guess, this massive global extraction of resources firmly tilted the economic scales. It created distinct, massive advantages. Because Europe and the United States held the keys, they controlled the factories and dictated the terms of global trade, wealth essentially flowed continuously in one direction. It moved straight from these resource-rich colonies right into the bank accounts of the industrialized powers.
And that leads us directly into our final section, a world in motion. Because beyond just shifting borders and extracting resources, the industrial age facilitated human migration on a scale the world had literally never seen before. But people were moving for wildly different reasons. Think about the push and pull factors here. On one hand, you had voluntary migration. So maybe well-off British engineers choosing to move to South Asia because they see lucrative new opportunities. But then on the tragic flip side, you have forced migration. We're talking about millions of Irish migrants desperately fleeing the extreme, deadly hardship of the potato famine, just trying to survive by making it over to the US. Let's move to and see how this builds incredibly complex global patterns. I mean, the sheer diversity of this movement is staggering. You had Japanese agricultural workers traveling across the Pacific to the US West Coast. You had Italian industrial workers heading across the Atlantic to build new lives in Argentina. And crucially, as literally millions of Chinese and Indian migrants moved to the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia, they didn't just assimilate and disappear. They established vibrant ethnic enclaves, these distinct communities that managed to keep their cultural heritage alive and thriving in entirely new host countries. Now, we can't just talk about the people who left. We've got to look at the massive human impact on those who stayed behind. Generally speaking, these huge waves of migrants tended to be overwhelmingly male. And that demographic shift, it led to completely new societal roles for the women remaining in their home countries. Because the men were gone, women frequently had to step up into roles, responsibilities, and heavy labor sectors that were previously completely male-dominated. It fundamentally shifted domestic and societal structures back home. It's a huge ripple effect. Of course, while all this migration resulted in amazing cultural intermixing, it also sparked some severe, often xenophobic backlashes. The political cartoons of the era reflect this harsh reality perfectly. Host societies frequently and loudly rejected these new immigrants. And this wasn't just talk, it directly led to targeted racist legislation. Laws like the American Chinese Exclusion Act were explicitly designed to legally block migrants from specific regions from ever entering the country. Well, that brings us to the end of our explainer. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a crucial question to chew on. How do the borders, migrations, and global economies that were completely forged in the 19th century still shape our map today? Look around, the Industrial Revolution was just so much more than steam and steel. It was this massive, global ripple effect of ideologies, economic shifts, and human movement that entirely rewired our world. The echoes of those exact same export economies, migration waves, and colonial borders, they are quite literally everywhere today. I highly encourage you to keep digging into this topic. It really helps explain the interconnected world we're all living in right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.